Hey. Good morning, everybody. I hope you're all doing well. My name is Corinne. I'm very happy to be here. And today I want to give you an overview of SDG 12 and 13, show you why it's so relevant today, and then also think about the policies that we can develop related to it. Okay, so I just wanted to begin with a short introduction about myself. So currently I'm an evaluations assistant consultant at the Green Climate Fund. It's the world's largest climate fund based in Songdo. But before that, thank you very much. Yeah, okay, working beautifully. So before that, I studied human, social, and political science at the University of Cambridge, and graduated from a master's at the Kai's College of Business in Green Business and Policy. Since then, I've worked with the UN Office for Sustainable Development, Global Green Growth Institute, and Korean Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So you can hear a little bit about me. Okay, so today we're going to begin by looking at SDG 12 and why we still need to care about sustainable consumption and production. Then we'll go to SDG 13 and think about why we need climate action. Then we're going to put this all together and apply this to the policy landscape. And then finally, we'll hopefully have a 15-minute Q&A where I really want to hear your ideas and so forth. And I will try to watch for time because I have so many things I want to speak to you about. Okay, so, but first things first, a few rules for today. First of all, I really want it to be as interactive as possible. So please feel free to raise your hand, or I'm just going to pick on people if no one says anything. So I warned you, okay, I warned you now. So I'm going to ask you a lot of questions. There are absolutely no wrong ideas, so don't feel afraid about that. And yeah, if you do have any questions, are there online participants as well? So yeah, so feel free to, you can put a message in the chat or you can raise your hand here as you prefer. Okay, so let's begin with SDG 12. So we need to understand why we need sustainable consumption and production to understand the value of SDG 12. So I'm going to briefly share with you the key issues. So this is related to population growth, consumption of resources and waste, and the effects of this on the environment. But first, we need to understand the key terms. So my first question to you is, what is consumption? You know, SDG 12 is about consumption and production, but what is consumption? What do we mean by that? Does anyone have any ideas? Okay, I'm sorry. I'm going to pick on you because you looked me in the eye. Buying something. Yes, yes, yes. Okay. Buying something. So usually you can buy a good or you can buy a service. And the point I want to stress is usually you buy something or do something to meet your needs or wants. So either I'm thirsty, so I buy water, or I want to eat some chocolate cake. That's consumption. And then related to that is, what is production? So does anyone have any ideas? Oh, yes, in yellow. Yes. Oh did you read my notes beforehand? That is like the perfect response. So essentially you're putting inputs together to create an output to meet the object of consumption. So to meet the needs or wants of people. So basically what I want to highlight is that production and consumption are very closely connected. Consumption has a need. So this is the object of production, and then production is meeting the needs of consumption. So you need consumption to have production, and you need production to have consumption. So usually if we talk about one, we should talk about the other. Okay, so why is this important? Why should we care about consumption and production? Well, I think there are two key reasons why we should care about the relationship between consumption and production. First of all, the world's population is growing. So currently we're around 8 billion people, right? But depending on what population forecast you look at, this could be around 14 billion people by the end of the century. So that's only 77 years away, and that's almost doubling the Earth's population. And so obviously, if there are more people, then there's going to be more demand for resources like water, food, energy, and so forth. So then the second reason that I want to highlight to you of why we should care about consumption and production is that a lot of us are using a lot of resources. So our planet is running out of resources, but at the same time, our global population is growing. So if the global population reaches around 10 billion by 2050, so this is 27 years away, it's not that far, the equivalent of almost 3 planets will be required to provide the natural resources needed to sustain our current lifestyles. So I don't know if anyone's heard of Earth overshoot today. If you're in front of me, can you raise your hand if you've seen this type of visual before? Okay, good. I'm glad it's something new for all of you. So Earth Overshoot Day is the date when our demand for ecological resources in a given year is more than what Earth can regenerate in that year. So it's basically a balance of how much are we taking from Earth, and then how much can it regenerate naturally. So obviously you can see in 1970s, like it was a balance, but currently we're using nature 1.7 times faster than it can actually regenerate. So aside from 2020, where obviously we had the COVID-19 pandemic, you can basically see it's been a steady increasing curve. And the key question is, if everyone lived like, the people of your country, so let's say if everyone lived like Koreans, how many Earths would we need? And so there's an interesting visual for this. You can see if everyone in the world lived like Koreans, we would just already have used the Earth's resources for the year by April 2nd. So that means in 3 months, we would have used all the Earth's resources if everyone lived like Koreans. There are countries that consume more resources. So Qatar, Luxembourg, Canada, UAE, US, Australia, Belgium, Denmark, Finland. They're all worse than Korea, so don't worry. And I guess the people who would survive the longest is those living in Jamaica, Ecuador, Indonesia. So to summarize, we see a growing population, but with a high consumption of resources. Okay, so I think the important question to ask at this stage is, do we need to use all of these resources? Because, if we need to use all these resources, we should just keep producing more resources, right? I'm going to quickly ask you guys, what do you think? Do you think we need to use all of these resources? Probably not. Probably not. Yes, I think that's probably the correct answer. Can everyone live like this? No, it's not sustainable. And I want to give you 2 examples to demonstrate this, why it's such an issue. So the first one I want to talk about is food waste. So too much food is being wasted or lost in every country every day. And I'm going to give you just a couple statistics. So first, 13.3% of the world's food is lost after harvesting and before reaching retail markets. So that's before it even gets to the shop, we already lost 13% of food that was made. Okay, and then when it comes to the shop, 17% of total food is wasted at the consumer level. So already 30% of food just wasted for nothing, basically. And in total, this comes to 931 million tons of food wasted a year. And this is despite a large global population, which is hungry, right? So it's about that balance. So on this graph, you can see Korea comes in at 15th place worldwide for one of the highest food waste rates per capita. And this data is taken from 2020. So it's quite recent. But what I want to highlight, what I think is interesting, is actually food waste is a problem in all countries, whether it's a developed country or developing country. So it's a very relevant topic. So in developing countries, 40% of losses occur at post-harvest and processing stages. So this means before it comes to the shop, that's where most of the food loss is. But in developed countries, more than 40% of the loss occurs at the retail and consumer levels. So that means once it comes to the shop, once people are buying the food, that's where the loss is made. And what's interesting is that, for example, in developed countries, it's because of our quality standards related to appearance. So basically, the food is too ugly to sell, so we just throw it away. So in the US, half of all produce is thrown away because it's deemed too ugly. So this is about 60 million tons of fruits and vegetables. So, we're using all these resources to make the food, and then we don't even use it. So, is that sustainable? Okay, so my second example is plastic waste. So these graphs show how much plastic ends up in landfill or is discarded. So on the left-hand side, you can see, for example, in 2015, an estimated 55% of global plastic waste was discarded, 25% was incinerated, and 20% was recycled. And then on the right-hand side, you can see of the 5,800 million tons of primary plastic no longer in use, only 9% has been recycled since 1950. 9%. I mean, okay, do we need to throw away all of this plastic? Are you really telling me only 9% can be recycled? And then, it makes me think, do we need to use so much single-use plastic? Obviously, there's some multi-use plastic, which, is a different case, but single-use plastic, okay, sometimes it's useful for medicine. You need it to avoid contamination between patients, that's important. But, if you go to Starbucks and get a coffee, do you need to use that plastic and then just throw it away? And then sometimes it's recycled, but most of the time it isn't. That's what I want you to think about. Okay, and why this waste is so problematic is how we produce it. So basically, we're using a lot of non-renewable energies to make these products. And non-renewable energies have a bad effect on the environment. So this graph demonstrates how our reliance on natural resources is increasing, and it's actually risen over 65% globally from 2000 to 2019. So I think one of the main changes we need to make to reduce our consumption is, one, changing our consumption habits, so maybe using less, but at the same time, we need to shift our energy supply to something more renewable and sustainable. But then, another issue is, for example, during the pandemic, we saw that there was a rise in fossil fuel subsidies. So these actually almost doubled from 2020 to 2021. And this is because obviously governments are trying to support businesses. Those businesses include fossil fuel companies. So they end up making more money in a time when, it's not good for the environment anyway. Okay. The negative and sad part is almost done. So it's just a little bit longer. Okay, so we've touched on this a little bit, but I'm going to ask you all, what do you think are the effects of unsustainable patterns of consumption and production, aka overconsumption and overproduction? What's the effect of this, if we keep using too many resources? Okay, I know no one wants to look at me, so I'm going to pick the lady second from the back in a V-neck, yes, with the red and blue V-neck. Yes, 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 you. Yes, 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 yes. No resources left. Okay. And you at the back as well. Yes. Running out of resources? Yes, exactly. So we're not going to be able to continue this current lifestyle if we just end up using all the resources. Okay, so I just want to add to this. What is said is that unsustainable patterns of consumption and production lead to this triple planetary crises. So climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. And this is because these practices exhaust the planet's life support systems, which worsens climate breakdown. So, for example, a study in 2015 found that the production and use of household goods and services was responsible for 60% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So that means what you're using at home to get it there, it takes so many emissions. So it's not very sustainable. Okay, so enough of the negatives. What can we do about this? Okay, so my next question to you guys is, what is sustainable development? I think you might have already covered this, but can anyone tell me? Okay, I'm going to take you, sir, at the back. While producing, yeah, so we can maintain our current lifestyles while producing the same amount. Okay, can anyone add to that? Maybe can I take your idea as well? Yes, okay. So what I like about combining your two ideas is about keeping our current lifestyle, but it's also about maintaining the earth and thinking about future generations. So essentially we can keep living, basically. So the definition I like to use is actually from 1987. So we've been talking about this for like over 30 years. It's development that meets the needs of the present, so us right now, without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So that means we can keep consuming, we can keep producing what we need to right now, and future generations can also do that. Maybe quick question, can anyone explain to me this image? Why have I included this image here? What's the meaning of it? I'm gonna pick the lady in pink, a pink jacket, yes. What do you think? No idea. Okay. Can I pick you in the black leather jacket? What do you think? Yeah, you hate the planet. No, I get it, Angie. Hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, and to take that idea one step further, it's like if we were all growing, if we were all doing the same, it wouldn't be sustainable. Like if the economy, like if everything was expanding as fast, like cats would be basically the size of buildings, mice would be size of half a building. Like it's not proportionate, this economy expanding. It doesn't work in connection with the environment. So it's just a little joke, but basically to say that we should all grow in proportion with each other. It can't be so unbalanced. Okay, so can someone connect the dots? How does consumption relate to sustainable development? We said sustainable development is about meeting your current needs without compromising the needs of future generations. We spoke about consumption and production and how it's not really good right now. How do these two ideas come together? Yes. Fantastic. So if we can reduce our consumption, control our production, this is positive driver towards sustainable development because it means future generations can continue to live. Okay, and the UN definition, which I like, which basically talks about sustainable consumption and production, summarizes the relationship like this. So it's the use of services and related products which respond to basic needs and bring a better quality of life while minimizing the use of natural resources and toxic materials, as well as the emissions of waste and pollutants over the life cycle of the service or product, so as not to jeopardize the needs of future generations. So I like this because it basically covers that us meeting our needs, us trying to reduce waste, like using fewer natural resources, trying to reduce the amount of waste, and thinking about the future generation. Okay, so basically that's why SDG 12, Sustainable Consumption and Production, is so important to sustainable development. I hope that was clear, but do feel free to raise your hand if this is unclear still. Now I'm quickly just going to run through a little bit about SDG 12. So it has 11 indicators. And for me, I think it covers a wide range of themes, but to me, it can basically be summarized in 3 key ideas. So it's problems, people, and solutions. So the different targets and indicators, in terms of problems, it talks about natural resources, food waste, and chemical waste. In terms of people, it talks about businesses and public awareness raising. And in terms of solutions, it talks about planning, access to information, recycling, technological and scientific capacity, reforming taxation systems, and so forth. Lots of solutions are proposed through these targets. But what's interesting about SDG 12 is actually some of these targets include a date. So this isn't common across all SDGs, actually, if you look at them. So, for example, one of them is to be achieved by the year 2020, so that's 12.4. 4 are to be achieved by 2030, so those are the ones in orange, and 6 have no target years. And for the sake of time, I'm just going to focus on those that are to be achieved by 2030. Okay, so the second target, 12.2, talks about the efficient use of natural resources, which we looked at earlier. It has 2 indicators which consider 2 measures, the material footprint and domestic material consumption. So material footprint, this is the proportion of global material extraction to the domestic final demand of a country. So basically, how many resources were extracted in another country to meet the demand of consumers in that country. So it's talking about the supply chain. And then domestic material consumption is a measurement of the total amount of material directly used in an economy. So how much are we consuming, basically? Now, something that's interesting for me, if you look at the indicators, so it has the indicator, for example, material footprint, but it also measures material footprint per capita and also per GDP. Can anyone explain to me why would they have these 3 different measures? Why do they want to look at these 3 numbers for the same indicator? Yes. Mm. Yeah, that's a very interesting idea. So thinking about what's happening inside the country, what's happening outside the country. Are there any other ideas? Okay, so just to add to that, I think what's interesting is each country has a different size population and a different type of economy, right? So for example, if we look at China, yeah, China has a big GDP, but it also has a very, very large population. So if I look at, for example, material footprint per GDP, if I look at according to China's GDP, oh my God, it looks really large. But then if I look at material footprint per capita, actually in China, it might be very, very low. So by looking at these indicators, the overall measure, then taking it into account per capita, which means by the individual, and then also by GDP, taking into account the economy, you're trying to get a deeper understanding of the reality, basically. Because otherwise, then you can just say, oh, every country with a high population has high consumption. But that's not always true. Yeah. Okay, target 12.3. So this target talks about halving per capita global food waste and reducing food losses along production and supply chains. It has 2 indicators based on 2 indexes. So the food loss index focuses on losses from production to consumption level. Earlier, we talked about how this is a big issue in developing countries. And then the food waste index measures food waste at the retail and consumer level. So we mentioned this is a big issue in developed countries. Okay, so 12.5, so the 5th target focuses on reducing waste generation by promoting prevention, reduction, recycling, and reusing materials. And it uses the national recycling rate to measure progress on this. And my question to you all is this a good indicator? And can you suggest any other indicators? Because for me, you're trying to reduce waste generation, okay? And they mentioned 4 different strategies, but the indicator just looks at national recycling rate. So I was like, why just that? So who thinks this is, can anyone justify why this is a good indicator? Or can you suggest to me what would a different indicator look like? How would you measure this target? Okay, I'm sorry, I'm going to pick you in the white shirt over there, yes. Do you think it's a good indicator to measure this target? Mm. 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 Yeah, no, great idea. I like that idea of comparing between different years, the production rate, because, I mean, just to develop your idea a bit further, if we're talking about prevention, then we would assume if prevention is working, then the production rate should go down, or at least it should go down compared to per capita. So the amount by each person, it should go down. So I think that's a good idea. The counter is some people might say, the national recycling rate is a good measure because 1, we have this data. Usually the problem is we don't have the data, so we can't have these other indicators. And 2, if recycling is getting higher or if it's getting lower, we can assume it's speaking to prevention and reduction. Like maybe if we see reductions in recycling, that's because the total amount is also reducing, that could be the argument. Okay, final target we're going to look at, and then we're going to jump to SDG 13. So this highlights that everyone should have the relevant information and awareness for sustainable development and lifestyles in harmony with nature. And the indicator here focuses on a range of educational measures, which, an example of today could fit into an indicator like this. Okay, just to conclude on SDG 12, I want to show you, how are we doing with regards to SDG 12? Well, I'm very sorry to say, according to the SDG index, okay, let's start with the positive. Sufficient action has been taken in Central Africa, woo, and pockets of Asia, woo. But major challenges remain in most developed economies, for example, North America, most of Europe, Australia, Argentina, Korea, yes, not doing great. But the positive is the trend is it's going up. So yeah, I think there's very few countries where it's actually getting worse. Most countries are either staying the same or getting better in some way. Okay, I know there was a lot of information, so fighting, keep going. Now we're going to jump into SDG 13. So we need to understand why we need climate action to understand the value of SDG 13. And as the same with the last section, I want to cover some key terms. So, can anyone tell me what's the difference between weather and climate? Is it just the same thing? Any ideas? Okay, yes. Mm-hmm. Ooh, yes. Okay, so you hit the key word there. So weather is talking about a shorter period of time, usually hours to days, and climate is talking about a longer period of time. So basically, climate is like lots of weather in a row. So today we're going to be talking about climate. So this is the long-term trends, which is, it's the average weather conditions over a long period. So why are we going to talk about climate? Well, I'm sure you've seen these kind of graphs before, but basically global temperatures since 1880, at least, basically since on record, have been consistently increasing. And what everyone tends to talk about is the Earth's temperature has increased by 1 degree. And you're thinking 1 degree, that's not that much. Like, why are we talking about this, right? And like sometimes, right now in Korea, like it's November. I think yesterday it was like 20 degrees. And I was like, that's really nice. Like, I have no issue with climate change. But the point I want to make is like, if, for example, when you get sick, your temperature gets a bit higher. So normally you're like 36, 37, but then your temperature becomes 38, 39. That's only 1 to 2 degrees, but your body really feels it. Like you have a fever, you want to lie down. That's basically the same as Earth. So if we increase to 2 degrees, the effect will be so much bigger. It can be life-threatening. So hopefully it makes sense why 1 degree or 2 degrees is actually a big deal when we talk about the changing climate. Okay, so we're going to talk about climate change a lot, but I want to clarify, what's the difference between global warming and climate change? Any ideas? I want to pick a new person, so I'm going to take you in the like brown, yellow jacket. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. So global warming is talking about a rise in temperatures, is specifically talking about the rise in temperatures, but climate change is a much broader term. So it includes global warming, but it can also speak about changes to rain patterns or wind patterns, maybe more natural disasters or something. It's a much broader term. So that's why in general, I'm going to be talking about climate change, but you can think, okay, that includes global warming. Okay. What do you think causes climate change? Why do we have climate change? Mm, yes. Perfect answer. Thank you so much. So if we're using fossil fuels, so this is coal, oil, or gas, they release carbon dioxide emissions, and this essentially leads to the warming of the earth. So we want to basically talk about the greenhouse effect. So when we burn these emissions, they release carbon dioxide, and it basically creates this blanket around the earth so that the sun's heat, once the sun's heat comes and touches the earth, it can't get back out, or it's much harder for it to get back out. And that basically creates this greenhouse effect where the earth gets warmer and warmer. Um, but what I want to show with this graph is actually we do need some greenhouse effect. Otherwise, the Earth would be too cold to live. But the issue that we're talking about is that we have too much now. So it's not a problem of greenhouse effect per se, but it's too much of the effect. Okay. And So you might be thinking, but how much of this is really related to human activities? And I like this graph because it shows you that, until the 1960s, like natural and human drivers of the global temperature, of global warming and climate change was pretty similar. But what we can see is clearly as countries industrialize and their economies expand, the influence of human drivers on the climate is becoming much stronger, much larger. So I hope it's clear to you that, okay, yeah, if we were talking 100 years ago, we don't have to talk about human activities, but currently it is related to human activities. And this might be a very obvious question, but when we talk about climate change and global warming and the Earth getting hotter, where does the heat go? Does anyone know? Where does it all go? What is absorbing the heat? I'm just going to say this one. It's the ocean. Okay, and then maybe you're going to understand why this is so problematic in a second. So we can see ocean warming dominates the increase in energy storage in the climate system, accounting for more than 90% of the energy accumulated between 1971 and 2010. So this basically means that the ocean is absorbing most of the changing climate in the Earth. Okay, this is problematic because it's likely to lead to rising sea levels, right? Because when the ocean warms, it's likely to expand. At the same time, when the ocean warms, the ice sheets or glaciers will melt, and this again leads to rising sea levels. Why is this a problem? Well, it's going to affect island or coastal communities, so people living in those areas. But at the same time, when the ocean absorbs carbon dioxide, it becomes more acidic. So it actually has a negative impact on marine life and coral reefs. So if any of you guys like to go snorkeling or scuba diving, it doesn't look as pretty underwater. And another interesting question that I like to ask is, are temperatures rising everywhere by the same amount? Okay, can you raise your hand if you think, yes, it is rising everywhere by the same amount? Okay, can you raise your hand if you think, no, it's not rising by the same amount everywhere? Okay, well done, everybody. Correct answer. So you can see by this graph that actually most of the temperature change in terms of increasing temperatures is in the Arctic Circle area. So this is in the north, north area, and it's actually, the temperatures are rising here about 3 times the global average. And this is so troubling, obviously, because this is where most of the ice is kept. So this is why it's so troubling that if we're melting all the ice, it kind of has this worsening effect where if you melt ice, there's less of a cooling effect, and then the sea gets warmer faster, which melts the ice faster, and so forth. Can anyone tell me, why do we see this big blue circle around there in the north? Because that tells me it's getting colder. Like, where is global warming? Why would we see a blue spot there? Yes. Fantastic. Exactly. So it's exactly because the ice sheets are melting that it is so cold there. So actually, if we see the blue, that is like a red flag. Like, we don't want to see the blue like that blue like that. It means it's melting very fast. Okay. And so maybe we can cover some of the effects of climate change. So it's some of them are similar to what we covered in SDG 12 in terms of impact on the environment. So we're going to see hotter temperatures, we'll see more severe storms, we'll see more drought. There won't be enough food for all, there'll be more health risks, and we're more likely to see poverty and displacement. So maybe I can explain just a couple of these. So when we talk about that, there won't be enough food because of climate change. Why are we saying that? Okay, so changes in the climate and increases in extreme weather events can lead to global rises in hunger and poor nutrition. And this is because it ends up destroying fisheries, crops, and livestock, or these agricultural areas become less productive. Obviously, I mentioned with the ocean warming, it becomes more acidic. So again, this affects marine resources. If you think about the fish or seafood you might want to be eating, that's at risk as well. And heat stress can diminish water and grasslands, which you need for grazing, which will lead to further declines in crop yields and affect livestock. You know, animals need resources as well, and animals as well are affected by heat and lack of water and so forth. And I think maybe one other to talk about is poverty, because you would think, you know, why is a social problem like poverty connected to climate change? That's personally what I was thinking. And climate change tends to increase the factors that put and keep people in poverty. So for example, floods, they can sweep away an urban slum and just destroy homes and livelihoods like that. Or heat can make it difficult to work outdoor jobs. Or wet water scarcity can affect crops. We can see that over the past decade, weather-related events have displaced around 23 million people on average each year. So that means it's leading to more migration. And we find that most refugees come from countries that are most vulnerable and least ready to adapt to the impacts of climate change. So I hope what you can take away from this presentation is that even though we're talking about an environmental problem, it will have very big social and economic impacts as well. And maybe to bring it closer to home, so let's look at Korea. And this is about the impact of heat waves. So if we see more rises in temperature. So as you can see from both graphs, Korea is expected to get much hotter over the next 75 years. And this is so problematic because of the impact on agricultural yields. So when people are trying to grow crops, can they grow anything? So looking at the chart on the right, so it shows you in orange and green if the amount of carbon dioxide emissions increases. So basically, if we see more climate change, and you'll see that there are going to be gradually there's going to be more higher temperatures. So you can see, you know, we're not going to see, let's say, -5 degrees as often. The lowest temperature is probably going to be around 0 degrees, and the highest temperature is going to get much higher. And the problem is, after 35 degrees, you can't really grow anything. So that means the amount that Korea can produce goes down. And so again, this kind of relates to our discussion with consumption and production. Can we sustain our current levels of consumption? Like, can we keep eating the same amount and the same type of food? So it's all interweaving. So to summarize, you now understand we're facing a climate crisis. This is caused by human activities, and this is likely to lead to a range of impacts affecting our environment, health, and livelihoods. Okay, so now let's move on to SDG 13. So can someone summarize for me, how is the climate related to sustainable development? So to remind you, sustainable development is about meeting our current needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. How does our discussion about the climate relate to this concept? Oh, yes, thank you. Mm-hmm. Fantastic. So we need sustainable development to kind of control the climate, because otherwise, if we continue with unsustainable development, the climate will get worse. So currently, our current activities are not sustainable and cannot achieve sustainable development, because it's unlikely future generations will be able to, for example, meet their need for food because they can't grow as much. Okay, so back to the SDGs. So now we can jump into SDG 13. And SDG 13 just has 5 targets. So instead of SDG 12, which had 11. And you might think some of these targets are not relevant to developed countries like Korea, but I want to emphasize that they've been made to try to be universal in meaning. So Korea has made actions actually towards some of these targets, but it's supposed to be universal. Okay, so let's jump into the first target. So this focuses on countries' resilience and adaptive capacity to climate-related disasters. It has 3 indicators about how many people. Okay, cool. If I need to leave, just tell me. No, I'm wondering if that's my phone. Okay, I'm sorry, Margot. I think it might be. Your phone is talking to you. Okay, never mind. So 3 indicators about how many people are affected by disasters, the number of countries with risk reduction strategies, and the number of local governments with localized risk reduction strategies. Okay, the second target talks about integrating climate change measures into policy and planning. It has just 2 indicators, which consider the number of countries with plans, including climate change measures, and the amount of greenhouse gas emissions per year. Then the third target focuses on building human and institutional capacity on this topic. So what we're doing today could fit into this. It has 2 indicators which look at how education on sustainable development is mainstreamed into our education systems, and the number of countries that have made plans to improve the institutional, systemic, and individual capacity on climate-related issues. Okay, so the 4th target is crucial because it holds developed countries to a financial promise they made in 2015 to mobilize $100 billion a year altogether to address the needs of developing countries who tend to suffer the worst effects of climate change. Okay, and my question to you guys is, why do developing countries need this money from developed countries? Like, why is that fair? Any ideas? Okay, so I'm going to pick on someone. So I'm going to pick on you, sir. Yes. Yes, in the blue navy blazer. Why do you think developing countries should get money from developed countries? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm. Fantastic. So you mentioned that developed countries primarily caused this rise in carbon dioxide emissions, and then you also mentioned that green infrastructure tends to be much more expensive. And I want to add that it's typically the developing countries where we see the worst effects of climate change. And in addition, they tend to lack the infrastructure to deal with this problem, on top of not having the specific green infrastructure. Great response. Okay, And the final target we can look at, so this highlights the need for us to support vulnerable countries and communities that are likely to be worst affected by climate change. And the indicator here focuses on the progress made by least developed countries, so LDCs and SIDS, small island developing states, to implement their climate-related measures. Okay, and how are we doing with regards to SDG 13? Yes, it's pretty similar to SDG 12, I would say. Who's doing great? Central Africa, pockets of Asia. Who's not doing great? North America, Europe, Australia. Korea, actually not in the red zone, so positive. But what makes us feel a little bit better is that the trend is a little bit more positive in terms of there's slightly less red now. But there is more red than compared to SDG 12. So maybe you want to think about, like, why is it harder to make progress towards SDG 13 than SDG 12? Something for you to consider. Oh, yeah, sure. This one? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I believe the trend is based on either year-on-year progress. So if you compare, let's say, 2015, 2016, blah, 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 and also the planned measures they have. So for example, we can say Europe has a plan to be carbon neutral by 2030. I think the US wants to be carbon neutral by 2050. China wants to be carbon neutral by 2060. Like, these are measures which show that the country is moving in the correct direction. So it can be a range of different measures that they use. Good question. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, so there's also going to be a Q&A, so you can keep your questions for there as well. So on to the third section. So now you understand the problems facing SDG 12 and SDG 13 and why these SDGs are still so relevant today and why we need to take action. So now I want to talk about what this means for policies and what kind of policies we should recommend. And I'll give you an example as well. So on this note, I want to highlight how the environment, which we've spoken about a lot, plays a central role in economic, governance, and social systems, which are part of sustainable development. So all of these pillars, economic, governance, and social, are based on the environment. And so I believe the strongest policy recommendations are essentially going to connect all of these together. That will make it a much more realistic policy proposal with a much greater chance of uptake. It means people will want to do it. Usually, so for example, I work at the Green Climate Fund. The way you kind of get money from donors, for these environmental projects is if you tell them it's going to create 10,000 jobs. It's going to create 10,000 new homes. You have to show them that it's connected to the economic and social systems as well. It can't just be about the environment. Okay, so we have to make fundamental changes. How are we going to do it? What needs to happen now? So one way we can categorize policies is into these groupings: social, political, economic, and technological. So social policies involve changing people's behaviors, and this can be done through regulations and laws, as well as education. And here we might want to think about the work of civil society groups and NGOs, which pressure politicians and industries to change. Political changes typically refer to policy changes. So as I mentioned earlier, the EU wants to be carbon neutral and it established the Green New Deal policy. The US said something similar. So they all want to be carbon neutral by 2050. China said it wants to be carbon neutral by 2060. So it's about integrating sustainable development into policies, plans, and projects. Then economic policies can mean integrating impacts on the environment into production costs and making these kind of more environmentally or sustainably friendly products and services cheaper. So, for example, we could make renewable energy cheaper and more widely available compared to fossil fuels. And technological innovation is also very important. For example, digital technologies like AI, this can help us change our behavior, or it could make some processes cheaper. I want to talk about two limits to this. So one is, for example, there are lots of laws like forbidding us to commit crimes, but we still see crime, right? So it's not a perfect solution. And you have to ask yourself, okay, why does a certain law not work? And you might also want to consider about the differences between developed and developing countries. For example, it's not even just about infrastructure. It can be about, do they have the right experts on the ground to make that project happen? Sometimes that is honestly like a very big issue at the fund, as you find like you want to do a project in a country, but they literally don't have the right people and resources to make it happen. They just don't have the same capacity. Okay, so how to make a good policy proposal. So here are my 4 steps to consider to make a good policy proposal. 1, be very specific about the problem you're trying to solve. Then 2, show that this is an important problem to solve. Maybe you want to bring in statistics. Maybe you want to explain the phenomenon. Then 3, connect this problem to the SDGs. And then 4, come up with specific policy recommendations that solve this problem. And as I've mentioned, I think the strongest ones are where they connect different issues. Okay, so I'm going to give you an example of how to do this. So my example is climate-induced migration. This is what I wrote my master's thesis about. It's a topic I'm very passionate about. So first step tick, I picked my specific problem. I think it's a great problem. Well, actually, let me define this problem first. So this is when people have to leave their homes because of climate-related conditions or weather-related disasters, and this impacts their livelihoods and so forth. So they have to move. Why this is an important issue. So for example, the UN estimates that by 2050, there will be 200 million people forcibly displaced from their homes due to climate change. So as climate change gets worse, we know that this problem is going to get only bigger. So this is something that we should tackle. Okay, that was my step 2. Step 3, how does this relate to the SDGs? So then I can say climate change, which is an issue tackled by SDG 13, will lead to more migration. So climate-induced migration is connected to SDG 13. Why does climate change lead to migration? Well, 1, the severity and frequency of climate hazards will increase in many regions. Then 2, population numbers are increasing rapidly in areas highly exposed to these hazards. So this means that there are going to be more people living in locations that are increasingly exposed to climatic hazards. And then 3, this means that people's ability to survive will depend on whether they can migrate. But in addition to showing how the problem is connected to the SDGs, I also want to highlight how the benefits of this solution are also connected to the targets of the SDGs. So the SDGs actually encourage migration as a way of surviving climate change. And this is because it means people can cope with the effects of climate change by obviously moving away from the dangerous areas. And it's a positive driver of sustainable development because it can help in poverty alleviation. So you tend to find that the financial remittances sent back home are larger and more stable capital flows than relying on overseas development aid or foreign direct investment. Migration can also contribute to multiculturalism and diversity. You see more social and cultural capital flows, and you see a transfer of knowledge and technologies which can further spur growth and development. So it's not just a problem the SDGs recognize, it's also got benefits that the SDGs are trying to promote. Okay, and so then I would give some policy recommendations about what we can do to help to encourage climate-induced migration as a solution. So, for example, at the political level, we can support the development of migration policy, which allows people to move around. This could be within the country. It could also be talking about international migration routes. This can be supported by technological policies, which make information easy to access online pre-migration, during journeys, and in destination countries. There could be applications to facilitate money being sent home. There could be ways to help migrants stay connected to their families. Then at the economic level, we can see rights for international workers so they can get work visas in a timely manner. At the social level, we could increase education around the value of migration so that migrants don't experience discrimination when they arrive. So from this example, I hope you can see that by picking a specific problem and understanding its value, there are a whole range of different policy proposals that we can suggest. And these would be helpful policy proposals with a chance of greater uptake. Okay, that's it for my presentation. I hope that was helpful. Now is your time to ask any questions. Otherwise, I've also prepared some discussion questions just to hear more about your views. I want to stop talking, so please. Yes. Yes. Okay, so you're talking about, usually this technology I think is called CCS, so carbon capture and storage. So this means that we're taking carbon dioxide emissions from the atmosphere, and usually you are storing it under rocks. And typically what they say is, okay, one, we see fossil fuel companies love this idea because it means that they don't really have to change their business model as long as they can just put more money into this new business, right? So that's kind of why there's some hesitation about this. But the positive about this technology is that some emissions are very difficult to reduce. So for example, if we think about cement production, cement is very important for buildings, for example, for different technologies and infrastructure, but it's very difficult to reduce emissions. So for an industry like that, it would make sense to invest in carbon capture and storage. But we have to make a balance between, when do we want to use it? Is it a solution for all industries? And personally, I think when you talk to, obviously, people working in the environment, what they say is it's good in a few specific scenarios, but we shouldn't rely on it. For example, something like energy, there are many cost-effective solutions now. Like if we think of solar and wind, we don't really want it to be a substitute to oil and gas. I hope that makes sense. Yes. Mm-hmm. That's a very good question. So, yeah, the question is about connecting overconsumption and production to biodiversity loss. So essentially, when we want to produce more, basically you need more space, right? So normally that leads to, for example, deforestation, or for example, when we are consuming more of one product, we tend to find, what do they call it, like monocultures or monocrops? Like we only want to grow one type of crop because it's the easiest to sell everywhere. So that's why I think, I don't know, there's an issue of bananas in Europe. Like we only allow one type of banana. And so actually there are many varieties of banana in the world, but because Europe only allows this one type of banana, that is reducing the amount of diversity. So it's thinking about the impact of global markets on what people are growing. And at the same time, the effect of trying to increase production means reducing the space for other places. Does that make sense? Great question. Yes. Mm-hmm. What's key to collaboration and solving climate change? Well, I mean, that's a very good question, and it's a very, like, it's something that I ask myself a lot as well. Recently, I read this article which basically said that international collaboration should be more strategic. So right now we have this Paris Agreement in 2015, which means everyone should try to limit the global temperature rise to under 2 degrees and ideally under 1.5 degrees. And basically what this article was saying is we're kind of collaborating for non-collaboration because it's like so generic and each country is allowed to do whatever they want to meet this target that it kind of like leads to inaction. So what this article was suggesting is that we should have more strategic collaboration. So for example, let's think the steel industry. Like Korea, I think, has quite a strong steel industry. And you mentioned the role of developed countries. Let's look at the countries that make up 75% of emissions. Usually this is only like 10 to 20 countries that are involved in the majority of emissions. Like we don't need all countries to kind of work towards reducing their steel manufacturing capacity. It doesn't really make sense. So instead, let's focus on those 10 to 20 countries and those that are heavily involved in steel and make them come towards a specific action. So the example of where this worked was, I think it was in 2005, there was something similar done about solar energy. And they basically said like, we need to increase the amount of solar photovoltaics. Like we need to increase the amount of technology. And because there was this specific action, by 2020, they had achieved like 4 times the target or something, because by doing the action, it makes it cheaper and then more people get involved, which makes it more cheaper and then more widespread and so forth. So basically, what I think the solution is to collaboration is let's make small groups and focus on very specific actions that are connected to what they do. Like there's no point for everyone to do everything. It doesn't make sense. And we have limited resources. So we need to be more strategic with what we do. I hope that answered your question. The next steps. Yes. That's a really good question. How to regulate greenwashing? Because usually, I think usually this is done on a national level, but speaking to the experience at the international level, a big issue we have is like countries that are heavily invested in oil. So for example, we have COP28, which is this big environmental forum coming up, and it's in Dubai, I think. And it's kind of funny because it's like a place where there's like so much oil production is like, why are they hosting this big environmental forum? Like it kind of doesn't make sense. But what I want to say is, for example, the Green Climate Fund, we received like a few applications for people to try to green their oil production. Like they try to make it more efficient, and they talk about energy efficiency, which is good. It is a good technology. We do invest in energy efficiency, but I think we made a policy of like not touching oil and gas. Like that's not where our money is most useful. So I think at the international stage, maybe it's about making specific policies or making mandates that like we don't invest in oil and gas, we don't touch any fossil fuels. And as an individual, you can make that happen by lobbying your representative. So we all have representatives on the board of, for example, the Green Climate Fund that represent developed countries and developing countries. And you can literally tell them like, look, I don't want Korea to invest in fossil fuels. And that will push them to say to the other countries, like, I don't think the Green Climate Fund should invest in this. And hopefully if there's enough people saying that, then you kind of make a mandate. Otherwise, I think for the issue of greenwashing, usually it's at the national level where you make like advertising restrictions. And for example, I think in the EU, one is about wording. So you can only use the word green if you prove that your process is XYZ. So you can kind of control words. Or two, it's about like proof of evidence, like you have to demonstrate it in some way. So there are different ways you can do it, but it depends at which level. I hope that was helpful. Any other questions? Yes. Wow, that is a big question. That was like the question of my thesis. So yeah, just to repeat your question, it's about how do we facilitate climate migration and how do we kind of encourage greater acceptance of migration in other countries? So I think the first point to mention is most migration is domestic. Like most migration happens within any country. Most people don't want to travel to another country. Like when people travel to a new country because of a natural disaster, it's literally because they don't have any other options. And I think, the reason why I became interested in this topic was like, everyone was talking about like, oh, we don't want immigrants, we don't want immigrants. But when I looked at the statistics, I was like, this is like less than 10%. Like this huge problem, this big wave is actually very small. So I think one thing about social acceptance is using facts and like real statistics to show you what is the reality. And part of that is you need to develop a data infrastructure. So when people enter the country, you need to record what they're doing. Like, for example, I think Korea is quite good at like tracking what visa each immigrant is on and what type of work they're doing and so forth. And that can help build kind of like a more realistic view of what people are doing. At the same time, I think if we're talking about international climate-induced migration, then we kind of need safe migration routes, because the issue is that right now it's considered like under the UN Human Rights Convention, climate is not considered like a justifiable reason to be a refugee. So there's no such thing as a climate refugee. But for me, and kind of looking from the academic side, it's interesting because we see that it's a problem. It's going to become a much bigger problem. But for some reason, in the legal framework, there's a lot of hesitation. People don't want to accept this new category. Obviously, they don't want to accept the new category because it means lots of people will be able to say they're a refugee because the issue of climate is so widespread, and we saw that it's affecting a lot of countries. So, you know, it's a balance between our countries able to accept people and the actual demand and the need for it. So, but what technically we need is safe migration routes, and then we need like visas that are available for people so that when they arrive to the country, they can become a legal refugee. And then usually it's about integrating people into society. So, for example, give them a work visa. Like right now, we have an issue in the UK where we have, I don't know if you heard of Brexit, like the UK left the European Union and now we're super independent, but we still have this migration crisis. So we have a lot of people that are crossing the English Channel and are coming into the country. And the new idea of the Prime Minister is that we're going to have like basically kind of, let's imagine like a cruise ship, but it's basically like a boat. And I think it fits, I don't know, like 450 people on it. And so they're literally just putting people onto boats so that they can't be in the country. But what people on the boats are saying is like, I want to work, like I want to do something. Right now we're paying those people like, I don't know, it's very little money. It's like £10 a week. It's like 15,000 won a week. We're just giving them that money. And people are saying like, no, I don't want the money. I just want to be able to live, but we're not giving them the right to work. So there can be lots of different legal things like giving them a working visa. And then, you know, once they get a working visa, maybe it's about the support they receive in the company. Like, do they have a mentor or something just to help them integrate into the country? Maybe it's about language classes, you know, something like that. Sorry, this is such a big topic. There are so many different ways it can take it, but I hope that was helpful. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So I don't know this topic very well because I don't have a law background, but I just needed to understand this as part of my thesis. But my understanding is basically because if we change it, if we say, yes, there can be a climate refugee, obviously there's going to be a lot of movement from developing countries to developed countries because that's tends to be where you see like the worst effects of climate change tends to be in developing countries, and then least effects tends to be like, you know, in the kind of the northern hemisphere where it's more developed. And so I think basically I'm going to assume that the reason is because developed countries don't want this. And I know there was an example, for example, New Zealand was going to create this like climate visa for people from the Pacific Islands. So it's very specific, very small number of countries, and they were going to create it. But I think eventually it didn't get through. And actually, I think there was hesitation from both sides, from New Zealand and from the Pacific Islanders, because I think the Pacific Islanders, they wanted something more permanent. Like, I don't want to be on a 6 month visa. I want to be able to move my home, you know, and move my family. So migration is a very difficult topic for that reason, because actually, as I said, people don't want to leave their homes normally. And then if you leave, you want security, right? So I want to say that there is some progress towards this in some countries, but there are so many different arguments from both sides, which make it complicated. I'll just give one more example. I think it's the country of Kiribati, which bought some, so this is like in the Pacific Islands, and it bought some land on Fiji. So because Kiribati is facing rising sea levels, so instead of creating like, you know, safe migration routes or migration visa, what they've done is they just bought land relatively in a similar region And the idea is essentially to move their people to that section. So that's another alternative, which kind of avoids, visas and different territories and stuff. But at the same time, what they find is more popular right now is just to move people inland. So it's just to move people in the same country towards a safer place. But obviously the issue is rising sea levels is happening very quickly. They're going to have to move again in 5-10 years. Is that a sustainable solution? Any other questions? Maybe just out of my interest, I want to see if you're more interested in SDG 12 or SDG 13. So if you're more interested in SDG 12, so this is about consumption and production, can you raise your hand? Okay, like a third, maybe kind of a half. Okay, and then who is more interested in SDG 13 related to climate action? Wow, that is so interesting. It's like 50-50. That is really interesting. Should I take more questions? I mean, I had a few discussion questions. I don't know if any of them will interest you. Maybe I'm going to pick one just to ask you. I'm gonna take question number 5, and I'm just interested in your thoughts. So it is, what is important in coming up with an effective and multifaceted solution? So what do you think are the key factors that we need to think about to make a good solution to any of these problems? Yes. Mm. Mm. Yeah, I really like that you picked out strategic collaboration, and I would strongly urge you when you're writing your policy proposals to be as specific about the target audience of the policy proposal. Is it lawmakers, or is it young people, or is it, the international bodies, for example? I would say try to be as specific as you can. Any other ideas? Okay, well, I was kind of surprised, like no one mentioned money. Like, isn't money a big thing? And I think that's as much as we're talking about, big ideas and let's make it happen, I think something that's important to consider is, the balance with reality. And usually it's hard to get money. So again, it's about being clever about resources. So for example, some of the data you saw, do some countries already have this data? That's much easier to use than to ask a country to kind of develop new infrastructure to find that data to prove something and so forth down the line. So I think money is very important, as well as strategic collaboration. And I think also think about human resources, like expertise, people on the ground, volunteers. All of those can be important in a useful solution. I think I will finish there, unless any final questions. Did you learn something new? Was it interesting? Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate the nodding. Sorry, this is just for me. Okay, well, thank you very much, everybody, for your time. And I think maybe Peter can share my email address with you, or you can find me on LinkedIn. Feel free to connect with me there or ask more questions. I'd love to hear from you.